Evening. Welcome to day 9 of the International Great Black Read Aloud Day 2023. We're borrowing a little bit from our West Coast and our our Western time zones. So we're going to say that we're still on day 9 because in the United States and beyond, it is still, it's still day 9. And so we are here live here on day 9 for the International Great to Black Read Aloud Day. My name is LD Robinson, and I am your reader for this evening. Our selection for today, before we get started, as always, I always have to remember to remind you that you should subscribe to our website. You should like and share this stream, this post when it comes across your feed, and that you should help spread the word about literacy and literature because that's what we are doing here at the International Great Black Read Aloud Day, affectionately known as TIGBRAD. We are giving voice to words written by Black people all around the world, and we want you to help us. We want you to help us share the good news and the great news that there are words written by Black people in every genre all across the world, and that we're doing a wonderful job at it. Well, I am taking my time tonight because last night I was a little thirsty, and as I was working today and listening to the read aloud, I realized that um, I didn't do such a great job from all that smacking in between. It was because I was thirsty. Okay. So I am back tonight and we are reading our selection for tonight. So let's get right to it. And so today is gardening and farming, and we are taking just a little different approach today to gardening and farming, somewhat in terms of the way of the results of perhaps the lack of gardening and the lack of farming, along with policies and things that affect our ability to have gardening and farming as prevalent in Black communities as they used to be in certain places on the globe. And so, this particular view, in terms of um, food, and I was went back and forth and thought whether I should include this when we talk about cooking or if I should talk about this when we talk about gardening and farming. But gardening and farming leads to they both lead to food. And so how does that affect us in terms of food? And what does it mean when we have food or when we don't have food? Or if there are other things that affect our ability to have food as a result of gardening and farming. And so our selection tonight is Eating While Black, um, Food Shaming and Race in America. And so this is our this is our cover, as we always show you. And this book is by Psyche A. Williams-Forson. She is a professor, Dr. Williams-Forson. And we're going to get right to it. And we are reading from the introduction. And I believe that's going to be um, um, plenty to think about and digest. The introduction. Worry about yourself. When food shaming Black folk is a thing, worry about yourself. Female African American WMATA employee, Washington Post. And that's the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority. In May 2019, an unsuspecting female African American employee of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Area Transit Authority was photographed while in uniform, eating while riding an area metro train. Natasha Tynes, a passenger on the train, took a photo of the employee and tweeted it with the comment, quote, "When you're on the morning commute and see a WMATA employee in uniform, in caps, eating on the train. I thought we were not allowed to eat on the train. This is unacceptable. Hope at WMATA responds, when I asked the employee about this, her response was, worry about yourself. End quote. Worry about yourself indeed. That's it. This is actually what this book is about. But we need to dig down to understand. For example, what would possess Times, an author and World Bank employee in Washington, D.C., to take this picture and post this tweet? Why did anyone, other than those on the train, need to know what this employee was doing? And why did Times feel as if it were her duty to inform the world via social media? What was the actual point of this communication? And could sorry about that. And could it have been accomplished by shaming this? And could it only have been accomplished by shaming this Metro employee? Most of us who use the DMV, that is DC, Maryland, and Virginia, Metro system are familiar with this policy, and almost equally as many applaud others when they subvert it. If you've ever been on the train, you know this to be true. But challenging the policy was not, in fact, necessarily the issue at play here. Because while Metro forbids eating or drinking, among other infractions, on its buses, trains, or in its stations, apparently an email had gone out early in the month advising Metro Transit Police to stop issuing tickets for, quote, fare evasion, eating, drinking, spitting, and playing musical instruments without headphones until further notice, end quote. The transit worker was obviously aware of the new policy. Times, perhaps, was not. On its face, it would seem that the incident, excuse me one second, and I must once again interrupt myself and make sure that we are good on a few technical things here. um, on its face, it would seem that the incident is run of the mill, a necessary calling out by Times of a socially disobedient employee who seemed to be breaking the rules that non-employees have to follow. But in our current cultural climate, where Black people's lives are constantly being policed, surveyed, and regulated, this incident takes on a more insidious meaning. Eating while Black, food shaming in America and race in America begins with this occurrence involving the female DC Metro employee, particularly because of the way in which the shamed Metro worker responded, quote, worry about yourself, end quote. Embedded in her plaintive response is the question, who are you to regulate me? This incident stands among a series of recent situations where Black people are publicly vilified and policed for living, quote, living while Black, end quote. These incidents have been and continue to be all too common and even more incredibly disturbing. From, quote, barbecue Becky, end quote, calling the police on Black families grilling in an Oakland, California park, to, quote, Starbucks Susie or Sam, end quote, calling police officers on two Black men in Philadelphia who were waiting for friends to join them in the coffee shop. Long before the present crisis of living while Black, I found myself thinking about what it means simply to eat publicly and privately as a Black person in America. So often, our food encounters, whether trying to get, prepare, consume, or enjoy food, are under fire. Somebody is always watching, waiting to tell Black people what they should and should not, can and cannot eat. And why? Why do African Americans' food cultures and eating habits elicit so much attention, criticism, and censure? The practices of shaming and policing Black people's bodies with and around food arise from a broader history of trying to control our very states of being, and this assumed stance is rooted in privilege and power. Eating While Black looks at how Black people's food cultures are shamed and surveyed in even the most innocuous situations. I situate this discussion within a broader context of structural and systemic racism, violence, degradation, socioeconomics, and exploitation, conditions that have always been inflicted upon Black people in American society. I specifically discuss three sites: movement and displacement, cultural trauma, and informal and formal informal food spaces as just a few of the many examples where these actions occur. Using food shaming and food controlling as central themes, as central frames, excuse me, I look at Black people's experiences because our relationships to food are and historically always have been intricate, from criticism and scarcity to creativity and ingenuity. In addition to the beliefs that our food cultures are limited to a particular set of foods, our culinary histories are often rooted in continued misinformation. This distortion aids in the idea that Black people are in more general need of regulation, correction, and control. The examples above, which took place in a coffee shop and at the park, are just two demonstrations of this belief. And while the food itself is not necessarily the central reason for this surveillance, the violence occurs within the context of a food event, so they are relevant to my discussion. Despite the burst of scholarship on African Americans in food, Black chefs, and Black owned eateries and restaurants, it is often still believed, even by Black people, that African American food culture is derived almost solely from, quote, scraps, end quote, or the only worst pieces of meat and offal, which is animal entrails. There is also the inaccurate impression that all Black people primarily eat what is commonly known as soul food. Foods such as fried chicken, fried fish, cornbread, collard greens, and macaroni and cheese. Yet, as quiet as it might seem, not all Black people are the same. Nor do we eat the same foods, listen to the same music, wear the same kinds of clothes, and so on, despite most of us having ancestral roots in the South. No matter if we live in the Mississippi Delta, New Orleans, Seattle, Detroit, or Bangor, Maine, it is assumed we are all the same. And there is no regard for those who might look African American but come from other countries throughout the African diaspora. Hence my use of both Black and African American, sometimes interchangeably. The discourses that imply Black culinary sameness are fraught with mistakes, even though they circulate throughout society at lightning speed, infiltrating our lives. I'm going to reread that. The discourses that imply black culinary sameness are fraught with mistakes, even though they circulate throughout society at lightning speed, infiltrating our lives. But when you look below the surface of any food conversation and dig deeper, you find that these discourses are generally denser, more multi layered, and more complex than we realize because they are informed by our gender, class, regions, levels of exposure, family dynamics, and more. Even when we are from the same cultural group. Food conversations seem simple because it is food and we all eat. The fun nature of reality television cooking shows, the fact that everyone eats so they are an expert on their own cuisine, and a general lack of reading leave many thinking that talking about food beyond a surface level is unnecessary. In fact, the subject is so taken for granted because food and eating seem simple. You get food, you prepare it or not, and you eat it. Most people do not know or consider food is a potent conveyor of power. But it is. Food is used daily in power dynamics. I realized this long before I began studying the ways that food and culture can reveal influence and control. When I first began my academic career, I worked at a university in New England. It was the 80s, and vegetarianism, though widely practiced, was not necessarily known to be as popular a way of eating as it is today. I participated in the major diversity assessment initiative that would affect the university's strategic plan. The two to three of us women of color on the committee often left the meetings feeling marginalized, silenced, and of course, extremely frustrated. Throughout the months of meetings, it became readily apparent to us that we were asked or told to be on the committee to serve as window dressing and little else. Rarely were our suggestions and experiences further explored, though they were duly noted. Shortly after the final report was submitted, we each received an invitation quote to celebrate our committee's work end quote by attending a cookout at the home of one of the higher ups who led the group. As a junior administrator, I felt my attendance was more than requested; it was required. I responded affirmatively, And when I followed the etiquette of my home training and asked her what I could bring, I was assured that I did not to bring anything. The host would take care of everything. On the day of the event, my sister and I traveled to the hinterlands of the region to attend the cookout. We arrived at the sprawling home and were ushered into the backyard where we were greeted by our colleagues. We were encouraged to enjoy the main dish, tofu kebabs. One of the other women of color took me aside and asked, "What is this?" My response, in a word, power. Each time I share this story, I think long and hard about it, applying what I now know about food, eating, and power dynamics. It is entirely possible that our supervisor simply cooked only what was familiar to her. On campus, we all knew she was a vegetarian because she often told us so. And since so few people on our campus were vegetarians at the time, it remained in our minds. But then, why not let those of us who were not vegetarian bring the foods that we wanted to eat when we asked what we could contribute? It was astounding, really. And as we sat around the table amid ready to be discarded paper plates of half eaten tofu, we were irritated by the lack of consideration. And we were hungry. I did not know then what I know now, but as we munched on baskets of rippled potato chips, we grew more and more angry that we had been dragged into into one more inhospitable space for the sake of our jobs. Perhaps our day party host thought she was exercising proper etiquette when she suggested that we not bring anything. Yet the elephant in the room was the obvious discomfort most of us felt at being forced into a situation where we were supposed to eat the unseasoned bean curd. Gosh, unseasoned tofu. Did she consider at all that many of us probably did not even know what tofu is? It was the late 1980s, so tofu was not necessarily eaten as much as it is now. Where were the hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, baked beans, bean salad, or whatever? Judging by the number of tossed aside plates, it was not only the people of color who rejected this single available cookout food, it was all of us. I summed up this event as power because the host made a lot of assumptions without consulting those of us whom she had invited. By not providing alternative foods, she had decided it was that dish and nothing else. How was this hospitable? For the faculty of color, the food event was even more disconcerting because, in both the professional and personal settings, power was exercised. On the committee, members of the group left the meetings believing that no institutionalized processes of change around diversity would be forthcoming. While a lot of lip service was paid to inclusion and equity, few concrete examples of institution accountability were mentioned in the final report, which we did not see but heavily questioned about its contents. Nor did any substantive change emerge in the short time I worked at the campus. In fact, I left the job because I felt my safety as an African American working and living in the residence hall with a majority of young white men had been compromised. Nonetheless, the diversity box was checked. Meetings were held, and people of color were in attendance. Short of this, little concrete action took place. Similarly, we went to the cookout and could check that box. However, we were offered one dish, half cooked tofu, and we either ate it or went hungry. We chose the latter and left the event in search of a meal that would satiate our bodies as well as our souls. We should be attentive to the subtleties of power and how they are exercised, especially in relation to privilege. Foods, like the tofu at the committee's celebration, mark time, place, and circumstances by their absence as well as by their presence. And power and privilege often work in the silences and the everydayness in which food resides. Sociologist Avery Gordon elaborates upon this point with regard to power when she plaintively states, quote, life is complicated, end quote. Acknowledging the banality and truism of the statement, she goes on to tell us that sociologists have yet to really understand the meaning of this quote in its widest significance, end quote, in part because of the ways in which power operates. Gordon explains how power relations in quote any historically embedded society are never as transparently clear as the names we give to them imply. End quote. This is because power is invisible and it can be fantastic, much as it can also be dull and routine. Gordon goes on to say that power, quote, can be obvious. It can reach you by the baton of the police. It can speak the language of your thoughts and desires. It can feel like remote control. It can exhilarate like liberation. It can travel through time, and it can drown you in the present. It is dense and superficial. It can cause bodily injury, and it can harm you without ever seeming to touch you. It is systemic and it is particularistic, and it is often both at the same time. It causes dreams to live and dreams to die, end quote. She concludes by admonishing readers, quote, we can and must call power by recognizable names. But so too we need to remember that it arrives in forms that can range from blatant white supremacy and state terror to, quote, furniture without memories, end quote. On that day at the cookout, power was delivered in the form of white, tasteless spongy cubes on a stick, and it was served to us unapologetically, as was the bland, empty rhetoric contained in the final report from the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. There is a richness in recognizing that even though foods do not speak, they do tell stories. One of the things I know from studying this topic is that one dimensional conversations about food are as absurd as they are ineffective. Foods operate on multiple levels beyond merely satisfying our stomachs. There is a lot to know and to share about food interactions, traditions, memories, likes and dislikes, habits, and tastes. So it behooves us all to shift how we talk about food and culinary cultures, especially those involving Black people. Shifting how we talk means we cannot simply rely upon mantras and slogans. Yet everywhere we look nowadays, there is a farmer's market, a bumper sticker, or a recyclable bag advocating that we, quote, buy local, end quote, or touting some other hip and cool catchphrase. Excuse me. And everyone, from pundits to journalists, food scholars, enthusiasts, and foodies, seem excuse me, seems to have some expertise on what is considered fresh, healthy, and wholesome food for all people. We are in the midst of food hysteria. Eating is no longer just about enjoying your food, but about assigning labels: organic, sustainable, healthy, clean, and local. And at the heart of this culinary madness is often an attitude of moral certitude that one person or group of persons is more knowledgeable on what everyone else should be eating, as well as when, where, and why. Furthermore, when we fail to adhere to this set of prescriptions, food shaming often occurs. Since 2007 and the publication of my first book, I have been traveling nationally and internationally, writing and discussing the intersections of gender, food, and power. I have also been observing how people engage food personally and professionally. Inevitably, people, most of them African American, tell me their stories. Young and old, people vehemently and excitedly share how they have been told and or been made to feel that the foods they find comfort in, the foods they like, love, and are familiar with, are unhealthy, unclean, and even harmful. These offenses against African American people are not isolated. Rather, they are very widespread. They are being perpetrated in doctors' offices, social services agencies, food banks, churches, schools, and of course in homes and at work. This behavior is not simply white on black, but also black on black across different racial backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, religious beliefs, and other cultural lines. As a result, this book's intended audience is fairly broad, from academics to laypersons, including anyone interested in conversations about food. This book is shaped in large part by the personal stories and observations gathered over the years, and from feedback I have received on presentations I have given. These responses suggest that those who are inflicting harm sometimes are unaware of the pain they are causing. For example, what may be proffered in the name of good intentions often can land with a thud, having a more destructive impact. On the other hand, there are some people who absolutely intend to offend others with their comments and actions. I saw this firsthand when I attended a food bank workshop in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. I was the only African American and the only non social worker in the room as we established our identities at the outset of the event. As we moved through the activities, I listened to the ways Some of the social workers chastise and criticize their clients for a range of offenses, trying to get more food than they were allotted, not knowing what some of the foods are, rejecting food that was unfamiliar to them, asking for culturally familiar foods, and so on. I did not hear a single conversation that recognized or acknowledged cultural traditions, cultural familiarity, cultural sustainability, or empathy, even in the broadest sense. As I sat, listening to the complaints of the other attendees, I could not help but wonder how some of the clients could benefit from discussions that were more open and multifaceted as opposed to dialogues that were laced with ridicule, assumptions, and stereotypes. The discussions that follow are designed to address these issues by opening up conversations rather than providing answers. The concepts here invite open dialogue and even disagreement. They are designed to provoke serious thought about the multi pronged issues related to food shaming and food policing, or what Vivian Halloran calls gastronomic surveillance. For Halloran, gastronomic surveillance refers to, quote, the observation and policing of a person's eating habits to ensure conformity with an assured norm. Most often, this regulating and surveying by other groups and even within a group is frequently undergirded by xenophobia, racism, socioeconomic bias, and other prejudice. It may also stem from self loathing and ignorance of cultural habits, be they one's own or those of others. Recognizing this, I come to this topic from multiple perspectives that center gender, race, and class. As always, I am interested in representations, how Black people see themselves, and how we are characterized with regard to food. So I use a multi level approach that involves stories to me, popular material culture analysis, literary analysis, self ethnography, and folklore, using a Black feminist lens as the portal. Approaching the topic from these perspectives allows me to connect people to real life experiences and in turn reveal the variations that inform African American people's lives. Also, using these narratives and the other strategies I employ highlights the translatability of food between and among people of the African diaspora, even as they reveal the dynamism of blackness vis-a-vis the unstable signifier of food. I say unstable because food is vulnerable to the manipulative whims and joyful maneuverings of people. People use food to say, I am happy, I am sad, I am mad, I am tired, and so on. Narratives about food told by Black women and girls are particularly dynamic for how they unveil the textures of interior lives. Their experiences unveil not only the ways women influence food behaviors and tradition of others, but also the powerful ways in which food communicates cultural norms and their aberrations. These tried and true approaches demonstrate how, as a woman and scholar of food ways, I understand the sometimes thorny terrains of power, food, identity, place, and gender, end quote. So while this book is written for several different audiences, it is also very intentionally geared toward African American communities. There is so little scholarship about this subject that is to, I'm sorry, that as Linda Tuhiwai Smith says in Decolonizing Methodologies, it is, quote, written primarily to help ourselves. When I travel to provide scholarly discussions, workshops, and classes, I am introduced to different kinds of food scenarios. I learned a long time ago that it is difficult to enter a situation involving food and not be a participant observer. Most of the time, my involvement is not extensive, but takes place for only a few short days while I am with my host. These short interactions mean I have to quickly capture my experiences while they are fresh in my mind. My habit is to write them down as I recall them happening, think deeply about them, and then process them with different groups of people. So most of the encounters reflected here are serendipitous, and they are plentiful. A perfect example of this kind of unanticipated scenario occurred during a conversation with an African American woman and friend of many years. When we first met, she was vegetarian and remained so for most of the years we were in graduate school. Years later, after we reconnected and while we were having dinner together, I noticed that she ordered a dish made with chicken. Later, I casually asked her about the change in her diet, and she explained that once she left the Northeast, her health changed. She noticed she was constantly sluggish, her breathing was difficult, and she experienced other physical and emotional pain. After a good while, and in concert with her physician's suggestion, She gradually began reincorporating some meat products into her diet. She went on to explain that almost overnight, she experienced significant changes in her energy levels. To be sure, this is not everyone's situation. Many people are equally as healthy as vegetarians and vegans. There is no judgment or insinuation. The point here is that any number of factors can affect what, when, how, where, and why we consume certain foods. Examples like this are used throughout the book to highlight the daily ways that foods are embedded with so much more meaning than we ordinarily consider. As we move about our lives, circumstances change, and these changes affect how we interact with our material world, from the choices we make as consumers to the ways in which we comment on the decisions made by others. And herein lies the tension between intent and impact. Throughout this book, we will explore how good intentions, aims, and ideas can land differently among various audiences. This is especially the case when the context has not been established to help ensure a successful delivery. In the example above, the context in which the conversation between my friend and me took place makes a difference. I was able to question my friend about her dietary choices because we have known each other for decades. We went to school together, so she knew me well enough to know that my query was born out of curiosity and not without intent to challenge or shame her. When these kinds of individual perspectives are not taken into account, our intentions can sometimes cause more harm than good. This is where an understanding of the material world and people's relationships to their objects is intrusive. And we are going to skip over to um, another portion of this. Excuse me. And I'm just trying to find my spot because I don't have a physical book in hand, y'all. Okay. All right. And I think I have my spot here. Oh, wow, that hurts me. All right. And where am I? Hmm. The chapters in this book are framed by one or more of the many food encounters I have had, and what I see as some of the important lessons we can learn from each. Food shaming of African American people did not begin yesterday or today. It is deeply embedded in the histories of our existence in the United States and the imbrication in anti Blackness, gender discrimination, class hierarchies, and the like. This is so much the case that some of us, as African American people, only know one history, and it is one that is only partially true, that Black people's food cultures are rooted in eating scraps, quote, scraps, end quote, or whatever enslavers could scrounge up, along with discarded animal entrails. In discussing some of the ways that this and other myths have taken hold in the African American psyche, I delve into the legacies with food traumas, including resistance to, as well as internalization of shame. Oftentimes, these legacies are so normalized that it seems African American foodways need saving, quote, saving. I'm sorry, let me repeat that. Oftentimes, these legacies are so normalized that it seems African American foodways need, quote, saving, end quote, as gender and food studies scholar Kimberly Nettles Barcelona discusses. These beliefs and others like them are rooted in notions that attempt to infantilize Black people and thus trivialize the details of our lives. Understanding these beliefs as belonging to a set of racial projects may help make sense of this behavior and offer some possible meanings for why they persist and how we can stop this madness in food centered contexts. Sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winnett argue that racial projects generally frame how we operate with race throughout the world. These projects are so normalized that they permeate every facet of our lives, from daily incidents to the implementation of public policies. It is a racial project that makes a barista believe she or he needs to call the police because a lone Black man is sitting in the coffee shop without having ordered. There is no need to ask him why he is sitting there because that would lead to the question of why anyone cares. People sit in coffee shops for hours on end without being questioned. No doubt he was most likely on his phone or doing something else innocuous while he waited for the rest of his party to arrive. But none of this is relevant when it comes to Black people, and especially not Black men, who are always assumed to pose a physical threat. It is the same kind of racial project that empowers a woman to call the police because Black people are cooking out at a public beach or removing groceries from their car outside a rental home, and is absolutely the same racial project that emboldens a random stranger to take a picture of a Black woman eating at her place of work and to post it on social media because the photographer assumed she was enforcing some policy she understood better than the actual employee. Within this framework, racism is so commonplace that it appears natural, and so the perpetrator feels it is normal to behave this way toward Black people. No, it is more than that. Many, if not most, white people believe it is their right to question the behaviors and actions of Black people. And if the answers are not satisfactory, these same white people believe they should take action. Yet when we call out this behavior as racial aggression, large or small, we are accused of, quote, playing the race card, end quote, or, quote, playing the victim, end quote. Because after all, what is the big deal? Why are Black people getting upset or getting an attitude because others are trying to be, quote, good citizens, end quote? Along with Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, the principal contemporary architects of critical race theory, Richard Delgado and I'm sorry, Jean Stefancic, identify several premises on which the theory is based. Primarily, the idea that racism is, quote, ordinary, not aberrational, end quote. Of equal importance to the theory is the argument put forward by Eduardo Bonilla Silva that, quote, racism is much more than individual prejudice or bigotry. It is rather, racism is a systemic feature of social structure. Given that racism is so deeply embedded in social structure, racial inequality often gets misrecognized as a natural process rather than a byproduct of a system of racial domination or a racialized social system, end quote. To this point, I like how scholar activist Kianga Yamata Taylor responds in a Twitter thread discussing how workshops on racism are praised and admired. While acknowledging there is, quote, a market, end quote, for these kinds of meetings, Taylor argues, quote, the notion that we will end racism one workshop at a time, one white person at a time, really undermines what structural racism really is. Racism in real estate, housing, employment, and beyond isn't because there are not enough nice white people in the world. The entire point is that it doesn't matter if you are nice or not nice. Capital relies on racism to extract, exploit, accumulate, and profit. Capital manufactures scarcity and sets different groups in competition for those scarce resources. Food, for example, that is grown, and this is my side point, food that is grown or farmed by people themselves, if you will, created an atmosphere where racism, xenophobia, nationalism, and all other divisions thrive. By manufacturing narratives about the loss of culture, culture and economic power, as well as by creating systems of lack and inequality and perpetuating ideas of black criminality and inferiority, societies submit structural differences that seem normalized because they are so widespread throughout every facet of our lives. This systemic part of racism. Racism is perpetuated between individuals, yes, but more so, it is in the ways in which white people move about society, assuming that they have the right to do this or that. This is what is meant by, quote, white privilege, end quote. I am willing to bet there are few people in the world, white or otherwise, who will voluntarily swap places with a black person, wealthy or otherwise. But there are many people who would willingly pass as white precisely because of the opportunities that come along with being perceived as superior. Taylor is right to point out, quote, to only focus on interpersonal relationships ignores the social and material world in which those relationships exist. This is high liberal folly dancing around the idea that we can educate ourselves out of structures, that ignorance is at the root of inequality, end quote. Food is not left out of this phenomenon. From the lack of restaurant franchise ownership to the erasure of any acknowledgement that historically and today, many black women and men chefs have been culinary masters, from repeated uses of blackface caricatures in food advertising to the continued association of black people with stereotypes. Racism is embedded deeply and disturbingly in food. These racial projects are often rendered invisible in their execution because they appear as commonplace single story narratives, reinforces they are played and replayed throughout popular culture, in magazines and in the daily news, throughout social history, and through daily interactions. Though often though often visibly displayed, the project of racially discriminatory thinking is entrenched and lodged deeply in food policies, leading to the practices wherein this insidious work is carried out. And we're going to end there because I um, think it is a fitting point, based on a story that I have heard multiple times and just had a recent conversation with some other. With different people about an incident that happened in my hometown. And this incident was, one gentleman saw, someone from a government agency, the USDA, that is, they saw a gentleman come around and started hanging things on trees. Now, I must tell you, where I grew up, there was an abundance of fruits and vegetables. It was farming land, it was country, and there were citrus trees, all kinds of foods, vegetables. People grew a lot of things, but there were naturally things that were available. There was nothing that you could not get basically could not get in terms of fruits and vegetables, in citrus particularly. Well, one day this gentleman tells me he's at his parents' home, and this guy walks up and he has this thing, and he says that he is combating fruit flies. There's a fruit fly problem, and they're correcting this. Well, the interesting thing about it is that after hearing that, and at that point, there was a conversation that ensued about, personal property and trespassing and all of that. um, Only to find myself a couple weeks ago having a conversation about gardening and farming and fruits and vegetables and the changing landscape of the area of where I used to live. And to have that a gentleman tell me, I believe in he believed that the government had introduced a disease that would kill off the citrus in the community. Now, this is the second time that I've encountered this same situation. And the gentleman told me at that time, he says, I remember what it was like. He said they had these vehicles, and there was this emblem on the side, this sign stuck to the side of the truck that said USDA. And for those who don't know, that is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which regulates and monitors agriculture development. Well, there's huge agribusiness. And so in gardening and farming, we know that there are a lot of policies, and we have discussed this and talked about this for the last 2 years when we come to gardening and farming, to our gardening and farming day, that there are policies that have affected whether or not Black farmers um, could thrive and continue to live. Also, that yes, there is a resurgence, but a lot of farmland was lost, based on these policies and lack of loans and assistance in order to make way for these huge agribusinesses and to make way for people to pay for things they were not paying for. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. Interestingly enough, in that same neighborhood, sorry, shortly after this happened, and people found themselves without certain things, there became there um, popped up. I'll say, there popped up a produce company who had relocated to this part of the city, this part of the county, I should say. Amazing, huh? That's what I thought as well. And so this type of the reason that Eating While Black was selected is because gardening and farming leads to food. And if people make it bad to eat certain things, they'll also make it bad for you to grow it and provide your own. And so there is a direct connection between the ability to produce one's food, the type of food that you produce, whether or not you're out there paying, $3 for, an orange, or you're pulling it from your own tree. These are very different things. And I can tell you that throughout the neighborhood, I drive at different times, and all the fruit and citrus trees that I used to see, I don't see those anymore. And this occurred over a bit of time, and it's very interesting. And so the connection between gardening, farming, and food shaming, um, along with race in America and being Black, and we are celebrating words written by Black people. We also have to put those things in context with where they matter. And so that is very important when we're talking about gardening and farming. I have a cousin who is a farmer, who's very proudly a farmer, and loves the fact that he provides foods, and he helps to provide fresh foods and vegetables for, um, not only his own family but also his community. And this is extremely important when it comes to gardening and farming and food. Gardening and farming lead to food. There's no reason to garden or farm if you're not going to produce food, something to be consumed, so, particularly for consumption. And so, this has been our selection today, Eating While Black, and we'll show our cover again, um, so that you can see. It is Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, by um, Psyche A. Williams-Forson. Well, we have ended. It's been a little longer read today, but I felt it was necessary to kind of put some things in context based on what I wanted to share at the end of this session on gardening and farming here at day 9 of the International Great Black Read Aloud Day. And I'm going to change my head here for a little bit. And we want to let you know that we will be back tomorrow, hopefully earlier, with art as our day 10 subject and our day 10 genre. It is art tomorrow. And in the meantime, we also want to let you know that if you would like or share our stream, that would you will be entered into a contest to win one of 10 Tig Brad t-shirts that we will be giving away, because we like to promote literacy and we want you to help promote it as well. So we're going to give you a t-shirt that you can walk around in. If you win one of 10, we will send it directly to you. And so if you don't follow us already, follow us online at Black Read Aloud. And we will see you tomorrow for day 10. Before we go, we want to remind you that we will be in, um, I'm sorry, that we will be in Daytona Beach, February 23rd through 25th at Fresh Book Festival. And we are going to pop this up so that you can see where you can attend Fresh Book Festival. And let me getting a little fancy here, getting everything lined up here. All right, now we have the screen up. We will be in Daytona Beach with Fresh Book Festivals, who is a partner for us in literacy, February 23rd through the 25th. And we will be at a reading revolution, which is the theme for this year. So go ahead and get your tickets at freshbookfestivals.net. And we will see you in just a couple of weeks at Fresh Book Festival. We are looking forward to it. We're excited. There are 50 plus, almost 50 authors will be there on site. with their books. There are a number of workshops and all kinds of things to help you. Everything from learning about being a ghostwriter to um, crafting books. We will also be talking with um, the folks at the Black Book Festival in London. And so Fresh went international during the pandemic, and we have kept expanding that international reach and collaboration on literacy, because that is what is truly important, making sure that we leave a legacy of literacy. Today, it has been day 9 of the International Great Black Read Aloud Day 2023. Our subject has been gardening and farming, and we will see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful night.